I work the night shift in the emergency department of a large urban hospital. It's a job I took because the hours suited my schedule better than anything else. But over time, I've come to understand that nights here have a different rhythm, something less predictable and often much more unsettling. During the day, the emergency room is a whirlwind of noise and motion, doctors and nurses weaving through the chaos with practiced ease. But at night, that same space seems to transform. The bright lights, the constant beeping of monitors, and the murmur of voices become muted, swallowed by an eerie stillness that settles over the hallways. My shift usually starts at 10 p.m., and I arrive just as the last patients from the evening rush are being moved to other wards or discharged. The crowds thin out quickly, and the bustle gives way to a quieter, more sterile atmosphere. The night staff is smaller, just a handful of nurses, a doctor or two, and me, the night clerk. I spend most of my time in the small break room near the nurses' station, occasionally checking in at the reception desk where I handle paperwork, patient charts, and phone calls. It's a routine that could easily become monotonous if not for the occasional unexpected event. Tonight, like most nights, I settled in with a cup of coffee and a stack of patient charts to review. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly, casting pale shadows that danced on the linoleum floors. Outside, the city was quiet, the usual hum of traffic reduced to a distant murmur. I found myself blinking slowly, the fatigue from the day tugging at my eyelids. The coffee helped, but I knew I'd need more than caffeine to stay alert through the long hours ahead. The emergency room was mostly empty now. A few patients lay in beds scattered throughout the room, some waiting for test results, others recovering from minor injuries. The nurses moved quietly between them, their footsteps soft against the polished floors. Every now and then, a monitor would beep, breaking the silence briefly before fading back into the background noise. I was flipping through a patient's chart when a nurse named Karen walked in, her face pale and her eyes darting nervously toward the far end of the hall. Karen was one of the senior night nurses, experienced and usually unshakable, so her unease caught my attention immediately. "Hey," I said, setting the chart down. "Everything okay?" She glanced over her shoulder before nodding slowly. "There's a patient admitted a couple of hours ago. No one really knows how he got here. He just showed up in the ambulance, but the crew said he was quiet, didn't answer their questions. No ID, no explanation." I frowned, intrigued despite myself. "What's wrong with him? Is he stable?" "Vitals are normal, but he's off, staring blankly most of the time, mumbling things that don't make sense. We try to get a history, but nothing coherent. It's like he's somewhere else entirely." I felt a chill despite the warmth of the break room. "Where is he now?" Karen pointed down the corridor. "Room 12B. I've been keeping an eye on him, but I'm not sure what to make of it." I nodded, my curiosity piqued. "I'll check on him in a bit." She hesitated, then added quietly, "Be careful. Something about him just doesn't sit right." I didn't say anything, but I understood the unspoken warning. Night shifts in the emergency department come with their share of strange cases, but this felt different. I stepped out of the break room and headed toward the hallway where room 12B was located. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, and the long corridor stretched ahead, lined with patient rooms on either side. The walls were painted a faded beige, and the linoleum floor reflected the dim light unevenly. As I approached the room, I noticed the usual sounds of the emergency department seemed to fade further, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed in on me. I opened the door slowly, expecting to see a patient lying on the bed, but instead found a man sitting upright in the chair beside the window. He was middle-aged, dressed in hospital scrubs that didn't fit him properly, and his eyes were wide but unfocused, staring past me as if looking through the wall. His skin was pale, almost translucent under the harsh artificial light, and his hair was unkempt. His lips moved softly, whispering words I couldn't make out. I cleared my throat gently. "Hello, I'm from the night staff. Can you tell me your name?" I asked. He didn't respond. Instead, his eyes flicked toward me for a moment, then back to the empty space beyond. The room felt colder than the rest of the hospital, and I shivered despite myself. I stepped closer, glancing at the monitor nearby. His heart rate was steady, breathing normal, but his expression was vacant. There was no sign of pain or distress, just an unsettling disconnect. "Do you remember how you got here?" I pressed. He shook his head slowly, the movement stiff and deliberate. Then, almost inaudibly, he muttered, "Don't trust the walls." I blinked, taken aback by the cryptic message. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer, only continued to whisper phrases I couldn't understand. It was as if he was trapped somewhere else, lost in a private world. I stepped back and closed the door quietly, my mind racing. I returned to the nurse's station and told Karen what I'd seen and heard. She frowned deeply. "Maybe we should get the doctor to check him again," she suggested. "Something about this feels off." Over the next hour, I kept glancing toward room 12B from my desk. The man remained still, his whispers drifting faintly down the hall. Occasionally, I thought I caught glimpses of shadows moving just beyond the edge of my vision, shapes that vanished when I turned to look directly. The hospital, which during the day felt like a place of healing and hope, now seemed like a labyrinth filled with unseen eyes. The night wore on, and the quiet only deepened. The usual sounds of footsteps and distant voices grew sparse, replaced by an almost tangible stillness. I found myself sipping coffee more frequently, trying to shake the creeping fatigue and unease. At one point, I heard a soft knocking from the far end of the corridor. I looked up, expecting a nurse or doctor, but saw no one. The lights flickered briefly, casting long, wavering shadows along the walls. I forced myself to focus on the charts in front of me, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. Karen came over, her expression grim. "I'm going to check on the patient again," she said. "Stay close." Together, we walked down the hallway to room 12B. The man was still there, whispering, his eyes now closed as if in a trance. We exchanged a glance, both unsettled by the silence that surrounded him. As Karen reached out to touch his arm, the lights flickered once more. For a moment, the hallway outside the room seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls fading into darkness. I blinked, and everything snapped back to normal. But the sense that something was wrong lingered. Back at my desk, I tried to push the feeling aside, focusing on the routine tasks of logging records and answering phone calls. Yet, every so often, I caught myself glancing toward the hallway, half expecting to see that same vacant stare or hear those incomprehensible whispers again. The night was still young, and I had a long shift ahead. But already, I knew this night in the emergency department would be different from all the others I'd worked. Something had shifted in the air, something I couldn't yet name, but that I could feel deep in my bones. A quiet unease that promised the night was far from over. Around midnight, just as the hospital's clock on the wall ticked over to 12 a.m., the emergency room seemed to grow even quieter. The usual hum of machines and distant chatter had dulled to a faint whisper. I was at my desk, still uneasy from the earlier encounter with the strange man in room 12B. The thoughts kept swirling in my head. His vacant stare, the cryptic whisper about not trusting the walls. I had tried to shake it off, focusing instead on the paperwork in front of me and the occasional phone call, but the sense that something was wrong lingered. Karen approached me quietly, her expression more serious than before. "You need to see this," she said, her voice low, pulling me toward the nurse's station. The doctor on duty was already there, reviewing the patient's chart. "He refuses to explain anything," Karen explained. "He won't say where he came from or how he got here. No ID, no family contact. We haven't been able to get a straight answer out of him." The doctor nodded, frowning. "Vitals are stable, but his behavior is worrying. He's unresponsive to questions, and his mumbling is incoherent. He's awake, but it's like he's somewhere else entirely." I glanced at the monitor again, noting the steady heart rate and regular breathing. Physically, he was fine, but mentally, something was clearly off. "Has anyone checked his room for any clues?" I asked. Karen shook her head. "Nothing. No belongings, no wallet, no phone. He's got nothing." The doctor sighed. "We'll keep him here for observation, but we'll need to get psychiatric involved. Something's not right." I watched them leave, then turned back to my desk. The room suddenly felt colder, the shadows in the corners stretching longer. As I sat down, I began to notice noises I hadn't before. Soft thumps echoing faintly from the far end of the hall, whispers just beneath the threshold of hearing. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, the mind playing tricks in the dead of night, but the feeling of unease deepened. Later, when I glanced toward room 12B, I saw the man sitting as before, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the wall. His lips moved again, mumbling words that made no sense. It was like he was speaking in a language I couldn't understand, or maybe speaking to someone, or something, that wasn't there. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. As the night wore on, the hospital's corridors seemed to change. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting fleeting shadows that darted just at the edge of my vision. I caught myself turning suddenly, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was no one. A nurse passing by mumbled, "Did you hear that?" And I looked at her, confused. "Hear what?" I asked. She shook her head, eyes wide. Footsteps. Behind me. But no one was there when I looked. I swallowed hard. Maybe just the creaking of the building? She didn't seem convinced. The whispers continued, faint and indecipherable, drifting down the hallways like a cold breeze. I found myself scanning the empty spaces, feeling watched. It wasn't just the patient anymore. Something else was stirring in the hospital's depths. Around 2 a.m., I went to check on the patient again. The hallway was darker now, the lights flickering more frequently. I noticed the shadows seemed to move with a life of their own, stretching and shrinking in unnatural ways. The man was still in his chair, his head tilted slightly, eyes half closed, mumbling softly. "Are you okay?" I asked quietly. He didn't respond, but suddenly his eyes snapped open, black, empty, and void of any recognition. I stepped back, heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, seeming to fill the hallway. I blinked, and for a moment, the walls around me seemed to ripple, as if breathing. The sterile hospital had morphed into something alien and unfriendly. I hurried back to the nurse's station, my hands trembling as I relayed what I had seen. Karen's face paled. "You too," she whispered. "I've been hearing the footsteps, seeing the lights flicker. I thought I was losing it." "I don't think it's just us," I said. "Something's wrong here." The night dragged on, each hour heavier than the last. More staff began reporting strange occurrences, doors opening and closing by themselves, cold spots in certain rooms, unexplained noises echoing through the halls. At one point, a security guard came rushing in, his face grim. "There's been movement on the cameras, down in the stairwell. No one should be there at this hour." We all exchanged uneasy glances. The hospital was supposed to be secure, but something was slipping through the cracks. I tried to focus on my duties, but the tension was suffocating. Every time I looked toward room 12B, the man seemed to be watching me, even when his eyes were closed. The whispers grew into murmurs, the shadows stretched longer, and the building itself seemed to pulse with a hidden life. By 3 a.m., I was certain the hospital was no longer just a place for healing. It had become a threshold, a crossing point for something unexplainable, and I was caught right in the middle of it. Around 3 a.m., the tension in the emergency department had reached a new level. The strange patient in room 12B had vanished. One moment he was there, his vacant eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the walls, whispering incoherent phrases, and the next, the room was empty. I was the first to notice. I'd gone down the hallway to check on him after hearing muffled sounds through the thin hospital walls, but when I opened the door, the chair was empty. The bed was unoccupied. The man had simply disappeared. Panic began to ripple through the small night crew. Karen and I immediately alerted the security team and started searching the corridors. The hospital's hallways stretched endlessly, but we called out his name as we moved through the dimly lit wings, our voices echoing uncertainly against the sterile walls. Every shadow seemed to ripple and shift, and the flickering fluorescent lights overhead only added to the sense that something was terribly wrong. As we searched, I couldn't shake the growing feeling that someone, or something, was following me. Almost every time I turned a corner, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. Footsteps echoed behind me, just barely out of sync with my own, but when I spun around, there was nothing there. The long, narrow hallways stretched on, empty except for the sterile hospital equipment and the faint hum of machines. The flickering lights worsened, plunging sections of the hallway into unsettling darkness for a few seconds at a time. During those brief moments, the air seemed to thicken, and I felt a cold pressure settle in my chest, making it harder to breathe. I heard whispers again, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Karen wasn't immune to it either. She kept glancing over her shoulder, eyes wide with growing alarm. "We have to find him," Karen urged, her voice trembling. "He could be somewhere dangerous." I nodded, trying to steady my own nerves. The hospital felt less like a place of healing and more like a trap. The patient's disappearance was no longer just a missing person case. It felt like something sinister was unfolding beneath the surface. As we moved toward the stairwell, the whispers grew louder and the air colder. The hospital, which was supposed to be brightly lit and sterile, now felt more like a haunted maze. I could see shadows stretching unnaturally long along the walls, moving in ways that defied logic. I stopped for a moment, heart pounding, and glanced at the security monitors on my phone. The cameras showed static in parts of the hospital, distorted images flickering in and out. Karen caught up with me, her face pale. "I don't like this," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "It's like the hospital itself is alive." Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, echoing against the walls. I spun around, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, except for the cold air and the flickering lights. My pulse quickened, and I swallowed hard. We decided to check the stairwell, which had been mentioned earlier by security as a place where cameras had picked up strange movement. The stairwell was usually off-limits at night, locked to prevent unauthorized access, but the door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open cautiously. Inside, the narrow, concrete staircase spiraled downward into darkness. The faint hum of the hospital above was muffled here. I flicked my flashlight on, the beam cutting through the gloom, revealing peeling paint and worn steps. The temperature dropped sharply, and a chill ran down my spine. As we descended, I felt the presence growing stronger. The whispers were clearer now, almost forming words, but still unintelligible. The shadows seemed to shift and gather at the edges of the light, creating shapes that vanished whenever I tried to focus on them. Suddenly, a low, guttural sound echoed up from below, a growl, or maybe a moan. Karen gasped, clutching my arm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, shining the flashlight into the darkness ahead. The beam caught a figure standing at the bottom of the stairs. It was the patient. His eyes were completely black now, devoid of any humanity. He stood motionless, staring at us with an intensity that sent a shiver through my bones. I took a cautious step forward. "We're here to help you," I said, voice steady despite the fear creeping in. "Please come with us." The man didn't move. Then, without warning, he lunged up the stairs with an unnatural speed and strength that was impossible for a man his size. I barely managed to dodge him, stumbling back against the wall. Karen shouted for security as he charged again. The struggle was chaotic. The man's strength was terrifying, his movements jerky and unnatural. I grabbed the emergency button on my pager, sending an alert through the hospital. Within minutes, security and medical staff arrived, restraining the patient with difficulty. As they sedated him, the man's body went limp, his eyes closing to reveal normal pupils once more. The oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly, but the unease lingered. We carried him back to room 12B and locked the door securely. Later, when the psychiatrist arrived to assess him, she reviewed his history and found it disturbing. He had a record of severe mental illness, but there were also notes about unexplained episodes, times when he vanished for hours or days without explanation, and accounts from family members of strange behavior that defied medical explanation. The hospital staff exchanged uneasy glances. Whatever had possessed or overtaken this man during the night was unlike anything we'd ever seen. The building itself seemed to hold secrets, and the patient was at the center of something beyond understanding. That night, as I sat back at my desk, the hospital's usual sounds returned, but the shadows felt heavier, the silence deeper. I couldn't shake the feeling that what we'd experienced was only the beginning, that the hospital held more mysteries and dangers that would reveal themselves in the hours ahead. By the time security and medical staff had managed to sedate and restrain the patient, the emergency department's atmosphere had thickened with unease. His eyes, now closed, had held that terrifying blackness just moments before, and the memory of his unnatural strength and speed lingered in my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. We returned him to room 12B, securing the door with extra locks. The hum of machines and distant voices slowly resumed their normal cadence. But for me, the hospital felt irrevocably changed. There was something in the air, something that clung to the walls and whispered just beyond hearing. The psychiatrist arrived soon after, a calm presence amid the chaos. She reviewed the patient's file, Her brow furrowed as she read through notes that detailed not only severe mental illness, but also bizarre episodes of disappearance, hallucinations, and unexplained behavior that no one had been able to explain. Family members reported times when he had vanished for days without a trace, only to reappear with no memory of where he had been. Some claimed he had spoken to unseen entities, his eyes turning dark during these episodes. "This isn't just psychiatric," she said quietly. "There's something more here, something we don't understand." I nodded, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. The hospital had always been a place of science and reason, but tonight it seemed to straddle the line between reality and something far darker. As the psychiatrist took over the patient's care, I returned to the nurse's station, rubbing my hands over my face to stave off exhaustion. But the unease didn't subside. Instead, it grew heavier, pressing down on me like a physical weight. That's when I noticed it, the faintest movement in the darkened hallway outside the room. I looked up sharply, heart pounding. Standing there, partially obscured by shadows, was the patient again. But this time, he wasn't sedated. His eyes were open, and those black voids stared directly at me. I froze, unable to look away. His mouth moved, whispering words I couldn't understand, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. The air around him chilled, and the lights flickered erratically. "Hey," I said softly, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're safe now. We're here to help." But he didn't respond. Slowly, he rose from his bed and stepped into the hallway. The hospital around us seemed to warp, the walls bending just slightly, the ceiling stretching higher, the shadows deepening into something almost tangible. I reached for the emergency button, but my fingers trembled. He moved with a fluid grace that was unnatural, his dark eyes locked on mine, and I felt a coldness seep into my bones. Suddenly, he lunged toward me with a speed that made me stumble backward. I barely dodged, heart racing. The whispers swelled into a cacophony, voices overlapping in a language I couldn't decipher. The shadows surged, swirling around us like smoke. Security burst into the hallway, shouting commands. The man's strength returned with a vengeance as he fought them off, his movements violent and unnatural. The struggle lasted minutes, each second stretching on as adrenaline flooded my system. Finally, they subdued him, injecting a sedative that forced his body limp once more. The oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly, but the echoes of that encounter remained. A chilling reminder that whatever had taken hold of this man was not just illness, but something far more sinister. In the aftermath, the staff gathered in hushed conversations, exchanging worried glances. Reports surfaced of other odd occurrences in the hospital. Equipment malfunctioning inexplicably, unexplained cold spots, and fleeting shadows seen in peripheral vision. I found myself drawn back to the patient's room, staring at the locked door. Behind it was a man caught between worlds, a conduit for something dark and unknowable. The hospital, a place of healing, had become a battleground for forces beyond comprehension. That night, as dawn crept slowly over the city, I sat alone in the break room, the weight of the night pressing down. I realized that the emergency department held more than just physical wounds. It harbored secrets and horrors lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the night to reveal them. And I was caught in the middle, a witness to a darkness that refused to be ignored. After the patient was transferred to a specialized psychiatric unit equipped to handle cases like his, the emergency department settled back into its usual rhythm, or so it seemed on the surface. But for me, the experience left a mark that refused to fade. The hospital, with all its clinical lights and sterile halls, had revealed a darker side, a reality where logic and science faltered in the face of the unknown. I found myself restless during the following night shifts, haunted by the memory of those black eyes and the unnatural strength that had surged from such a fragile body. The whispers, the shadows, the flickering lights, they hadn't vanished with the patient's removal. Instead, they lingered in the corners of my vision, a subtle reminder that the hospital held secrets beyond our understanding. The staff talked quietly about the events, some dismissing them as stress or fatigue, but others admitted to sensing something wrong long before the patient's arrival. A few nurses mentioned strange feelings in empty rooms, cold spots that defied explanation, and the sensation of being watched. It was as if the hospital itself was alive, breathing beneath the surface, its walls hiding stories no one dared to tell. I reflected often on how the night shift exposed those of us who worked it to encounters far removed from the daylight world. The quiet hours peeled back the layers of normalcy, revealing the eerie and the inexplicable lurking just beyond our perception. Sometimes, when the emergency room emptied and the only sound was the steady beep of monitors, I would catch myself glancing toward room 12B, now occupied by another patient, and wonder what shadows still clung to those walls. Working nights in the hospital means more than just managing trauma and medical emergencies. It means standing guard at the edge of a world where the familiar blurs with the unknown. That night taught me that some horrors don't announce themselves with screams or violence. They creep in silently, hidden in whispers and shadows, waiting for the right moment to surface. I carry that awareness with me now, a quiet vigilance that shapes every shift. The hospital is a place of healing, yes, but also a place where the unseen waits patiently in the dark, and sometimes it reaches out. And though the nights continue and the patients come and go, I remain watchful, knowing that the line between reality and something far darker is thinner than I ever imagined.